Hi, everyone. My name is Lane Porter. I serve on the Charis Circle Board of Directors. It's my pleasure to welcome you all tonight to the virtual space of Charis Books and More, the South's oldest independent feminist bookstore. We are gathered tonight to welcome Victoria Chang in conversation with Anjali Enjeti for a discussion of Dear Memory, Letters on Writing, Silence, and Grief, a collection of literary letters and mementos on the art of remembering across generations. First, I'll introduce our conversation partner, Anjali Enjeti. Anjali Enjeti is a former attorney, journalist, teacher, and organizer based near Atlanta. Her books, Southbound, Essays on Identity, Inheritance, and Social Change, and the novel The Parted Earth were published in 2020. Her other writing has appeared in the Oxford American, Harper's Bazaar, USA Today, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, Washington Post, and elsewhere. She teaches creative writing in the MFA program at Reinhardt University. Welcome, Anjali, and thank you for being with us tonight, helping to celebrate this beautiful and moving book by Victoria Chang. Victoria is the author of Dear Memory. Her poetry books include Obit, Barbie Chang, The Boss, Salvinia Molesta, and Circle. Obit received the Los Angeles Times Book Prize, the Anisfield-Wolf Book Award, and the PEN Voeckler Award. It was also a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Prize and the Griffin Poetry Prize, and it was longlisted for the National Book Award. She is also the author of a children's picture book, Is Mommy?, illustrated by Marla Frazee and named a New York Times notable book, and a middle grade novel, Love, Love. She has received a Guggenheim Fellowship, a Sustainable Arts Foundation Fellowship, and the Poetry Society of America's Alice Faye D. Castagnola Award, a Pushcart Prize, a Lannan Residency Fellowship, and a Katherine MacDowell Colony Fellowship. She lives in Los Angeles and is the program chair of Antioch University's low-residency MFA program. I know we have a lot of friends and fellow writers in the audience tonight, so we want y'all to help make the chat feel like home. This is Victoria's last stop in honor of Dear Memory. So please say hello in the chat and let us know where you're watching from. And if you want to, put any questions you may have for Victoria in the Ask a Question box in the bottom center of your screen. So welcome, Victoria and Anjali. It's truly an honor for Charis to help get to celebrate Dear Memory.
Thank you so much, Lane, for helping out with this event tonight. And thank you, Charis Books and Gifts, for hosting this event. Charis Books, for those of you who don't know, is a fabulous feminist bookstore, one of the only ones left in the US. And we're so lucky to have it here in Georgia. I am so thrilled and honored to be here with my friend, Victoria Chang, who has written yet another extraordinary book, Dear Memory. Please be sure to order it at the bottom of your screen. I thought it would be great if we could start out by having Victoria read an excerpt from her book. This book has a really unique structure, and there are visuals inserted in the book, and this will give you all a good sense of what she's writing about and the kind of story she's telling.
It's not. Okay, my internet's not working that well for some reason. So if anyone can't, if you can't hear me, just put it in the chat, or Anjali can just let me know that you can you hear me?
I don't even know if anyone can hear me.
Hold on, let me type this in chat. Can everyone hear me and see? My internet isn't good. Okay, good. All right, so thanks for coming. Thanks to Charis Books, and obviously, Anjali, it's great to see you. I'm going to share my screen, and hopefully it'll work okay. And then I'm going to read just a couple poems from my book, Obit, and then I'll read a little bit from the new book as well, but I won't read for super long. I just look forward to talking to Anjali. Let's see, let me go here. Okay, so I'll go here. Okay. So can you see? Yeah, think you can see it, right? Okay, so I will make it larger so you could probably see it a little bit better. And just make it my whole screen. Okay, so I'll read a couple poems first and we'll go that way. And again, if you can't hear me or see me, just let me know. So I'll read a couple poems from this book, Obit, and they're just little obituary poems, and they're based on really my mother passing in 2015 of pulmonary fibrosis. And my dad is in some of these poems too. He had a stroke. So I'll just start reading these. Music. Died on August 7th, 2015. I made a video with old pictures and music for the funeral. I picked Hallelujah and a cappella because they weren't really singing, but actually crying. When my children came into the room, I pretended I was writing. Instead, I looked at my mother's old photos, the fabric patterns on all her shirts, the way she held her hands together at the front of her body. In each picture, the small brown purse that now sits under my desk. At the funeral, my brother-in-law kept turning the music down. When he wasn't looking, I turned the music up because I wanted these people to feel what I felt. When I wasn't looking, he turned it down again. At the end of the day, someone took the monitor and speakers away, but the music was still there. This was my first understanding of grief. Maybe I'll read this one. It's called My Mother's Teeth. And she had dentures. Died twice, once in 1965, all pulled out from gum disease, once again on August 3rd, 2015. The fake teeth sit in a box in the garage. When she died, I touched them, smelled them, thought I heard a whimper. I shoved the teeth into my mouth, but having 2 sets of teeth only made me hungrier. When my mother died, I saw myself in the mirror, her words in a ring around my mouth like powder from a donut. Her last words were in English. She asked for a Sprite. I wonder whether her last thought was in Chinese. I wonder what her last thought was. I used to think that a dead person's words die with them. Now I know that they scatter, looking for meaning to attach to like a scent. My mother used to collect orange blossoms in a small, shallow bowl. I passed the tree each spring. I always knew that grief was something I could smell, but I didn't know that it's not actually a noun, but a verb, that it moves.
Beautiful.
And maybe I'll just read one more from this book. I'll go to the other book. This one's called Grief. Grief, as I knew it, died many times. It died trying to reunite with other lesser deaths. Each morning, I lay out my children's clothing to cover their grief. The grief remains, but is changed by what it is covered with. A picture of oblivion is not the same as oblivion. My grief is not the same as my pain. My mother was a mathematician, so I tried to calculate my grief. My father was an engineer, so I tried to build a box around my grief, along with a small wooden bed that grief could lie down on. The text kept interrupting my grief, forcing me to speak about nothing. If you cut out a rectangle of a perfectly blue sky, no clouds, no wind, no birds, frame it with a blue frame, place it face up on the floor of an empty museum with an open atrium to the sky, that is grief. So I'll read a little bit from this book, which is called Dear Memory. And my poet friend, Dana Levin, called Dear Memory a branch from the tree of Obit that grew into its own tree. And I actually think that's really true. And it's a really organic book, and it's hard to explain what it's doing because I didn't know what I was doing at the time. Obviously when my mother passed away, I didn't want to write any poems about her. But then after I had written a whole book of poems, I definitely didn't want to write any more about her. But I ended up writing more because I had to clean up a storage facility, and I found all this stuff in it, and I exited having way more questions but no one to ask them to. And I grew up in a family where silence was our main language. And so I wrote a letter to my mother, which then led to a whole bunch of letters and then a whole book of letters and a bunch of other things, which I'll show you in a second. But this is just a little bit of this letter I'll read you, but it's about maybe 4 times longer. Dear Mother, I have so many questions. What city were you born in? What was your American birthday, your Chinese birthday? What did your mother do? What did your grandmother do? Who was your father, grandfather? It's too late now, but I would like to know. I would like to know why your mother followed Chiang Kai-shek, taking you and your 6 or 7 siblings across China to Taiwan. I would like to know what was said in the planning meeting. I would like to know who was in that meeting, where that meeting took place. I would like to know the people who were left behind. I would like to know if there are other people who look like me. I would like to know if you took a train, if you walked, if you had pockets in your dress, if you wore pants, if your hand was in a fist, if you held a small stone, if you thought the trees were black or green at night, if it was cold enough to see your breath, to sting your fingers. I would like to know who you spoke to along the way, if you had some preserved salty plums, which we both love, in your pocket. I would like to know if you carried a bag, if you had a book in your bag, where you got your food for the trip, why you never knew your mother, father, or your siblings. I would like to have known your father, to know what his voice sounded like, if it was brittle or pale, if it was blue or red, to know the sound he made when he swallowed food. I would like to know if your mother was afraid. During college, I spent several weeks with her in Taiwan. She bought me baozi, buns, every morning. The bao that steamed in small plastic bags with no ties, and sweet doujiang, tofu milk, always too hot for me to drink. She sat there and watched me eat, complained to me about your brother's wife, complained of being sick and how no one would help her. Do you know how long it took me to figure out how to call an ambulance? And then when they came, she refused to go. I still remember how the 2 men stared at me, as if I could move a country. Listen, it's the wind. That's the same wind from your countries. Sometimes, if I listen closely at night, I can hear you drop a small bag at the door. I hear the sound of the bough touching the ground and the wind trying to open the bag. But when I open the door, there's nothing there, just the same wind, thousands of years old. Happy birthday, wind. Happy birthday, Mother. April 6, 1940. I know this now. All the nurses, doctors, and morticians asked me, so I memorized it. Your American birthday, April 6, 1940. I said again and again, as if I had known this my whole life. So then I started writing more letters, and at some point I started putting aside some pictures, photos, and documents that I thought were interesting, and I started putting them onto making little collages. And I'm not a visual artist, but I was just kind of messing around with the physical object. And eventually I landed on some slips of paper that weren't fastened to the page. And I'll just read little poems that I wrote. And here's just one. I think this may have been the first little poem that I wrote. And I'm the little one in the middle in the white, and that's my sister on the other side, and that's my mother. I hear the phone ringing, but I can't answer it. It is silence calling. Then at some point, I remembered that my mother actually, I had recorded in one interview with her when a long lost cousin who stayed in China had written a letter to my mother, had found my mother after all these decades, because obviously when war happens, families bifurcate and then they never see each other again. And so I had taken this opportunity to ask if I could record the translation and also ask other questions. So I'll just read a tiny bit of this. But the thing I always think about this is how clinical it seems. I don't know if it was my mother's clinical translation or if the letter was really like this. I guess I'll never know. I don't know where the letter is, but I'll just read a little bit of the transcription. Me, have you heard from your relatives in China? Mother, I just found my cousin. She's 2 years younger than me. She just sent me a letter. She's had a very hard life. She has 3 daughters. And then my mother translates the letter. 1950. Cousin and family moved to Hubei and had to learn new thoughts. 1950 to 59. Every 2 to 3 days, they had to participate in new movements to suppress the revolution and to fight against the Americans. They had to take all of their pots and metal doors and burn them to make steel. But moving away from farming led to starvation and famine. 1959 to 61. Natural disasters caused people to starve to death. People had no meat, no food. We had to participate in more movements. We had food coupons to eat. It took 10 years for things to improve. Suffering in the stomach was okay, but the mental suffering was what was unbearable. And then it keeps going. And at some point in 1975, I think the father had a brain hemorrhage and he died when he was just 51 years old. And I'll read the last one. 1978, mother survived and had an okay life after that. None of us could go to college because we had been sent to the outskirts to do farming. In 1980, we finally came home. I wrote letters to my grandmothers that I didn't really know, and they were based on documents that I had found. So I found certificates of marriage, and suddenly I knew people's names, what age they were. You know, these are people I never really knew. And I wrote more poems. This photo is, I think the person in the middle is my great grandmother, and I'm guessing because I think I look like her. And then my mother is above, and then the people surrounding her, all her siblings. And I think there are a couple missing, but I think maybe they weren't born yet. But I'll read you this small poem. Once you had to stand behind your grandmother who left a country, each of your feet lifted off the land onto the boat like nightingales. I imagine the night sky, you below deck, light coming from 2 moons, but only half of your face lit up. You stood still as the moons rearranged themselves. During the switch, language was lost at sea. When language belongs to no one, a door opens. At some point, I found other documents that my dad actually worked at Ford Motor Company for most of his career. And I found all these letters where he had perfect attendance, which I thought to be so funny when I first found the letters. But then I also thought they were really sad once I started looking at the dates and thinking that I was not thinking about him at all. So I wrote him a little poem, and I put my thumb and I imprinted it sort of on in a card to make it look like he was holding it. I'll read it to you. Was this your first job? Look at the window behind you, as if leaving a country was all perspective and light. I wonder what is in your hand. It's so thin and small. It must be my home. I wrote letters to old teachers, which I won't read. There are quite a few actually in the book, and the book ended up being actually a little bit like my development as a writer and how I became a writer. And so there's a little bit of that kind of stuff in there too. And then I play around a lot of collaging and things like that. It was really fun and difficult process. But maybe I'll read one more poem from Obit, and then I'll stop there. This is the penultimate poem in the book, Obit, and it references the Marjorie Stoneman shooting in Florida. And it was actually a prompt from terrain.org. They asked for, they saw these obituaries around in journals, and they asked me to write a letter to America. So here's my assignment. America died on February 14, 2018, and my dead mother doesn't know. Since her death, America has died a series of small deaths, each one less precise than the next. My tears are now shaped like hooks, but my heart is damp still. If it is lucky, it is in the middle of its beats. The unlucky dead children hold telegrams they must hand to a woman at a desk. The woman will collect their belongings in shadows. My dead mother asks each of these children if they know me, have seen me, how tall my children are now. They will tell her that they once lived in Florida, not California. She will see the child with the hole in his head. She will blow the dreams out of the hole like dust. I used to think death was a kind of anesthesia. Now I imagine long lines, my mother taking in all the children. I imagine her touching their hair, how she might tickle their knees to make them laugh. The dead hold the other half of our ticket. The dead are an image of wind. And when they comb their hair, our trees rustle. Thank you.
I love that.
Here without screwing everything up. Let me stop sharing. Okay.
I'm so glad, Victoria, that you read. You not only read, but you shared.
Okay. Is Anjali still here?
Yeah. Oh,
it says the stream was able to connect. Maybe she's not here. Can y'all hear me? Let's see. Okay, you can all hear me. Hi, Gabby. How are you? Maybe Anjali's not here. Oh, good. Hi, Jimin. We can hear and see you both. Oh, maybe. So Anjali's still here, but I guess the stream's so maybe she needs to get back on. Well, as we wait for her, please put your questions in the ask a question box below. I already see one in there. So I'm going to start answering your questions because she may be having some connection issues. And then also Crowdcast is a little confusing. So I don't know where everyone else is, but I'm glad you're all still here and you can see me. Ruby wrote, so poignant. I would like to know, you say, and in asking, you're telling us so much. My mother in India tells me that her senile uncle recently burnt all the family papers of the time when her parents, my grandparents, came from Pakistan to India. So I'll just ask and ask as an historian, that's what I do, and write, oh, I think they're coming back. Hi, women back in history that are lost to us. Please say more on the act of asking questions. That's a great question, Ruby. Hi, Anjali, was just waiting for you to come back.
Sorry, I got kicked out with my internet.
I figured it's something. I know we're having something happen today, which is awesome. But I'll answer that question, then we'll go back to you.
Yes.
But yeah, I think for me, the whole book is about questions and having no answers. And initially for me, my friend, the poet, Rick Barrett, actually said this early on. He's like, this book seems like a journey of silence. Like initially you think that, like me, think that silence is sort of this really awful thing. And that's true. I want to know so much. And the whole book came out of questions. But by the end of it, I realized that silence is its own form of language and that it's not all bad. And with that silence is, and the question asking, you can fill it all in with a lot of imagination. And also, what else can we do? We don't know the answers to things. So like forcing those answers that you'll never get to come out became a sort of useless exercise. And so I realized that partly the reason why I'm a writer is because I grew up in a family of silence and I didn't know anything. So I could fill it all in, with imagination and my own creativity. So, yeah.
I love that. That was a great question. And thank you for covering me for me.
No worries.
I actually thought I was still here until you said something because I saw myself on the screen. But anyway, I'm so glad, Victoria, that you talked, that you showed us the visuals for both Obit and Dear Memory, because the question I had, which was my first question, has to do with how you came to these structures. But I want to start that question out with a quote from Dear Memory, which when I read this quote, I was like, is this her way of talking about how she decides on structure for her writing? And it's in a letter to your grandmother, and it says, what form can express the loss of something you never knew but knew existed? So I wanted to find out how you settled on the structure of Obit, how you settled on the structure of Dear Memory. Did the idea of the subject matter come first, or did you sort of visualize what the structure would be first?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And, being sort of like a formalist poet in many ways and a formalist writer, I get asked that question a lot. And it's a really interesting question to think about and what form means to me. And I always describe it as like being like a Terrence Hayes quoted this. This is a Terrence Hayes quote, like a bird flying freely within a cage. But my bird actually also leaves that cage, and I don't know if it's going to come back, but maybe it usually does. So form is really important to me as a writer, I think. And I think of it as a correspondence. So I think of everything that I'm writing, I feel like I need to be pressed against something and be talking to someone or asking questions, to go back to what we were talking about before. And so for me, I think for Obit, the prompt, it became a prompt. I didn't want to write the traditional elegy, but then something triggered this Obit thing, and I was listening to the radio on NPR, and and I just wrote one thing, the bees died. And that poem actually ended up being way in the back of the book, but the bees died on a certain date. And that allowed me to start writing about the death of my mother. But then I wrote another one and then another one. And then they're all in notebooks sort of spread out. But at some point when it got onto the computer, I started messing around with the actual physical form. And that's when the physical shape took place. But I certainly didn't know what I was doing while I was doing an Obit, but it sure does seem like it. It's such a clean book when you actually look at it. And the Dear Memory was a mess. So I think I started with just writing a letter, and then I kept on writing letters without really thinking about why or who, or I just sort of kept on writing them. If I had more, I just kept on having more questions, and I had all these. I just talk to people is really what I was doing, dead people mostly. And then I wrote to a lot of childhood memories started coming through, and then the book had a kind of a memoir-y feel. And yeah, I never really expected it to be a book, so I was very open in it and was, just really honest, and wrote about a lot of stuff that I've never really written about before about my childhood, because I think it's been really easy to present myself as having a really easy childhood, especially given the kind of colleges that I've gone to. Everyone seemed fine, if that makes sense. So I had to also present a certain fineness, like, oh, I had a great childhood, everything was fine, kind of thing. My parents were fine. But I really didn't. And so I think being honest and authentic was a part of that process. And then it ended up kind of, I've had to really, really try and shape it, because it was a bit of a hot mess. And I think it still is structurally. Somebody wrote it structurally complex, and I was like, oh, that's a euphemism. It's very it's kind of disorganized.
Speaking of which, I'm just curious, and before I ask the next question, I just want to remind our attendees, please drop your questions in the Ask a Question chat. I just saw a second one come up. Let me ask this question first, because it naturally leads from what you just said. I'm curious, letter writing in general is it's kind of a fading form of communication, right? I mean, we send emails, we send texts, we send DMs, but not so much the formal letter, and especially not so formally to people we know, people we have intimate relationships with. Just curious if you had a letter writing practice before you started writing Dear Memory, if it was something that you used to do a lot.
Yes. I mean, I want to hear what you have to say about this, because I think we're almost exactly, if not exactly the same age. We're pretty close. And I was just looking in my garage for just something, and I found boxes and boxes of letters. I've kept all of them, and I started looking through them, and I loved writing letters. And there's something beautiful about the art of letter writing and the art of waiting for a response. And then that's something I was reading some old letters recently. Something's really interesting. It's like by the time someone writes you back, like what you wrote them about is already long over. And we talk about those things in that letter, like people have written, oh, by the time you get this, you might already be. And so there's all these really interesting elements about having to wait, that patience, and that gap that is also a gap of silence, when we're talking about it. But I loved it so much, and it really helped me not be quite as lonely as a Taiwanese and Chinese American girl growing up in a mostly white community. And so it was really important to me. I don't know, did you write a lot of letters, pen pals and stuff like that growing up?
What's interesting is, because I think we're like mid-Gen Xers, if I'm correct, right? I wrote a lot of letters until I was in my early 20s, and then it just sort of dropped off for me. But what I'm finding really interesting is that it feels like during this pandemic, people are returning to letter writing. They're returning to talking on the phone. And so that's been super interesting for me. We have a couple more questions in the chat, Victoria. This is from Jill. Jill asks, Was writing about your grief therapeutic? Did you learn anything new about yourself while writing about this topic?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was, I mean, I cried a lot when I was writing the Obit poems in particular. And I'm not, I wouldn't say I'm like a super crier. Lately I've been more so, but yeah, I felt like it was essential to write those poems, and I was really just trying to see if I could put language and explain through language what grief felt like to me, at least, and knowing that I'd probably ultimately fail, but if I could get, an inch to it or a foot to it or a centimeter to it, I felt like, boy, what a cool process. And the other thing too is I felt like there were a lot of books, grieving sort of books in prose writing. So The Long Goodbye by Megan O'Rourke, Joan Didion's books, obviously. There are a lot of those books, Grief Observed, classics. But I felt like in poetry, the elegy was very present, but the elegies I read never really made me feel anything. Like I just appreciated them, bless you, like Lilacs Last in the Dooryard Bloomed, by like Whitman, or I mean, like all those pastoral elegies, and I just, I read them and I appreciated them, but I didn't feel like it helped me at all, as someone going through that. So I kind of think I set out without consciously thinking about it to write a book that I really needed for myself in poetry. So I think it was absolutely therapeutic and necessary. And for writers, I don't know if you feel this, Anjali, but I do. Like writing for me is like water. It's like air. It's like food. It's like if I don't do it, I feel like I'm gonna die. I mean, like I need it to live. And so it's always therapeutic, if that makes sense. It's a very big part of my life.
Absolutely. Thank you for that question, Jill. We've got another question here that I'm just going to go ahead and ask. Victoria, why did you place your own life/death, hope I am right in reading that, in Obit? Why did you think of including yourself in an obituary?
Yeah. Hello. Yes, I am exhausted, but I'm actually happily exhausted. I think you can be like energetically exhausted. It's a really strange paradox that I feel. But yeah, I think really interesting question, because I do put a lot of I write a lot of obituaries to myself, and I'm thinking back on it too. I think something that I've noticed with me, at least, is that when someone you care about dies, like your whole, and it doesn't even have to be like a person who dies. It could be like a relationship that dies, like a friendship that's severed or something, like something, a whole world dies, because you have a certain way of communicating with that person. So whole language dies, like the way that I talked to my mother was only the way that I talked to my mother and no one else. And we had not the way that she talked to my sister, that we had our own language. And it's like, I know that you know what that feels like. And so I felt like once my mother died, I died. And also she held so much of my history and all my past, and never told me anything, and wasn't very communicative, that I felt like when she died, and that's how Dear Memory formed, like my entire being and my whole history just severed. And I felt really empty. And I think that's how people feel anyway. But I think immigrants, and immigrants' kids like me, like you don't realize how important your parents are as a conduit to your entire history, because you live through them, you live your history through them. And you're in a country that's also, I feel and always feel very alienated in this country, and grew up in a certain way where I was completely alienated. And so I think that you realize that you really are nowhere, and you really have no country, and you really are lost without your mother, who you thought this whole time was just your mom, not a big deal. But when she died, I realized, oh my gosh, she was so much more than just my mother. You know, she was my country. She was my people. She was my background. You know, she was like the person that looked like me, kind of thing. So, yeah.
Oh, I think that is so true. And that really resonated with me too. I think when you grow up in the diaspora, the context of your existence is not around you the way it would be if you stayed in your parents' or your grandparents' origin country. I felt that so much in your book. And that actually leads to one of the questions that I had was, one of the sort of questions, one of the themes I felt very strongly from Dear Memory was, who does memory belong to? And does that change when someone passes away? And you've touched on that a little bit. How did you sort of approach that when you were writing this book?
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting. I thought a lot about memory. And I also was doing a little bit of research. So I did, I as a writer really think it's important philosophically to know all the things that were written before you. And that involves also, the academics that are studying, various things. So like memory studies, and then memory studies related to immigrants and migrants and immigration, and also, Asian American studies. And so I'm always really interested in reading, what this, Asian American psychologists are writing about, and what are they studying, and Asian Americans and depression. Like I do a lot of that kind of reading because I think it's like, if I'm going to be a creative writer, I think it's incumbent upon myself to know what my other colleagues are doing in other fields. And so I did a lot of reading on memory studies, and it was there's so much great research out there. And I quote some of it, actually, only a little bit of it, even though I read a lot more of it. But by the end of the book, I was really interested in this idea of post-memory. And it was in a book edited by Julia Crete and Andreas Kitzman, and it's called Memory and Migration. And they talk about this concept of post-memory. And I'll just read it because I think it's so interesting. Post-memory is a powerful form of memory precisely because its connection to its object or source is mediated not through recollection, but through an imaginative investment in creation. Post-memory characterizes the experience of those who grow up dominated by narratives that preceded their birth, whose own belated stories are evacuated by the stories of the previous generation, shaped by traumatic events that can be neither fully understood nor recreated. And I read that, I was like, oh my gosh, like that's the whole intergenerational trauma work that people have been doing. And and it was just so interesting to me. And it just made a lot of sense to me, this idea of post-memory, how, I'm just not me. Whereas all along, in America, it's like very much so, it's all about you, your independence, your sort of like individualism, right? Versus the collective. And here I was having just completely reframed my thinking when my mother passed, is that, oh no, actually, I'm made up of all of my history and all the trauma and history and experiences of my mother, in ways that I had no idea, and country too, obviously. And so I definitely, have thought a lot about memory, and yeah, I mean, I think I will just say that. But maybe I'll read another quote from this visual artist, Yvonne Singer. She said, she had left Hungary for Canada during World War II, and she so aptly wrote, I was between worlds, alienated from the Canadian world of my peers and excluded from the history and culture of my parents, who placed a veil of secrecy on the past. And so I don't think that's always the case. I think some people talk a lot. I've had some friends who tell me that their parents were like constantly jabbering to them about their upbringing, but mine didn't. And I think that is something that I hadn't really thought much about before, but it's completely, I think, based on the traumatic experiences that my mother had leaving China. My dad is way more happy-go-lucky. now I see why, because he was born and raised in Taiwan. So he just came to America, which again is super traumatic. But my mother was, she had to run from a country. And so I think that trauma was carried through how she raised us too.
I wonder if that too has something to do with sort of the cultural context. Being Asian, it seems to be a common thing that a lot of Asian parents really, our community tends to not deal with mental health issues or talk about mental health issues. And we also tend to just sort of seal trauma behind a wall.
That's right. Yeah. No, I think that's really true. And I think that my mother was, she clearly struggled with anxiety, and generalized anxiety. And my sister had various health issues, mental health issues that, I'm not even comfortable stating, because if she heard about me telling people about this, she would flip out, because I had written a piece in the New York Times Magazine. And during the fact-checking process, she pretty much made me take out really important stuff to the story. But there are a lot of mental health issues in our family that have gone sort of ignored. And I think that's super common. And then I think our culture also, growing up was very much so get over it, kind of get through it, you'll be fine. And I think even now, I still hear like some people say the weirdest things about the pandemic. It's like, just chin up, it's like, look for wonder and joy. And I'm like, no, you can't look for wonder or joy. Like, it's not something you can fix. It's like, but it's fascinating to me. I prefer to live in challenges and difficulties and find ways to be communal and acknowledge those feelings now. And so I think I feel very differently now. But there's a lot of shame, I think there's a lot of shame in communities and people. And I just don't think that's healthy in the long run, but people sometimes people want you to look strong and be strong. Oh, you're so successful, you must be, this or that. But sometimes I just want to tell people, it's like, well, I feel awful things all the time. And, but we're expected to, people want us to be successful, if that makes sense, their idea of successful.
Yes, absolutely. Victoria, we have two questions. I think Gabby had asked, what is the name of that book again? I think she was referring to that first study that you cited. Can you say one more time what that was? Was that in a book or was that in an article?
Yeah. Was it the thing about post memory?
Yes, the post memory.
Yeah. Yeah, I'll put it in the chat. It's a great book, actually. I read it cover to cover.
Awesome. I would love to read it myself. That sounds fabulous.
It's so good. Yeah. And it's an anthology. So it's really diverse in the types of things they talk about. It's actually on my shelf. I see it right over there. But they have artists, visual artists that are talking about things, like psychologists. It's so interesting. And it's not just about memory. It's about memory studies specifically related to migration. And that's what I think is really interesting.
We've got another wonderful question in the Q&A from Jimin, who asks, hi, Victoria. I was wondering if there was any kind of tension between writing a letter and speaking to the person you were writing to. If there were moments where words bled into the realm of speech rather than a formal text. What a really interesting question, Jimin. Thank you for asking that.
Yeah. Hi, Jimin. I think that's a great question. And I think this is a great question about writing, actually, because I feel like sometimes we're writing and then sometimes there's a consciousness about our writing and how we're making it something that may be consumed, right? So sometimes I feel like I'm just writing and just kind of like writing for myself. And other times I have this awareness that, oh, that's not quite as artful as if I say it this way or that way. And I do think that there's a difference between the written and speech. And sometimes I feel like and those are similar to those sort of craft choices that we make about what I'm talking about too. It's like, at what point does what we're writing become like a piece of art? You know, like at what point does it become more than like a diary entry or a letter that's just kind of riffing or free writing or something like that? And so, yeah, I mean, I think I tend to write for the written word versus the speech. But it's interesting thinking about, like, one of my friends was talking about like what kind of poet they are. During one of the readings, actually, it was the poet Maggie Smith, and she was saying how she tends towards concision. So she just kind of trims everything down to the bone as a writer and starts writing like tightly. And I think I'm kind of in the middle. Like I'm if I start writing, I'm kind of naturally a little chattier, a little more spoken. And then I have to sometimes remember, oh, wait, I'm supposed to be writing poetry. So I need to not be so chatty because I'm obviously chatty as a person. And so I think thinking about, and then there's some people who write really chatty, and then their poems feel kind of like loose and chatty and diction and discursive-y kind of thing. And so I think kind of knowing where you gravitate to naturally as a writer can actually help you think about what it is you're writing and what that particular piece might need. Like, does it want to be really concise and tight and have a lot of gaps? Does it want to be a little more prose-like? And so, yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but I started babbling. But I was thinking, like, you know, Dear Memory, I do write a little bit about my, mother and grief, but it's obviously a little bit looser. And the letter form allowed me to be a little more chatty and prose-like, which I think suited me at that moment.
I want to ask you, Victoria, about my favorite line in Dear Memory. And it was so profound to me that I actually had to, like, I gasped and I put the book down for a second. I was just so moved by it.
Now I'm wondering what it is.
Yeah, drum roll, please. This is in a letter. It's Dear L. You write, "You remember only what astonishes you." And that line, I found it so profound because it made me really sort of understand and think about how selective our memories are. And so I wanted to ask you, is it a memory if it's something that is just so ingrained in our minds? What about the memories that aren't there? How do we understand what memories we choose to hold tight onto and to sort of ingrain within ourselves, and the ones that never quite make the cut?
Right. Yeah, no, I think it's a great question. I think memory is so interesting for all of the reasons that, or all that you're saying. We all have so many memories, and you and someone in your room at the time when you were 12 would write down totally different memories. We've all heard that. I asked 6 people at a car crash what happened, and all 6 people would say something different, which I think is the beauty of memory, is that it's fallible. It's also not easy, and it's not precise. It's mysterious. It's all the things that writing is. So in many ways, I think memory is poetry. It's fiction, it's creative nonfiction. It's the basis and the root of so much because of all those gaps and silence. And and I think that a lot of writing the root of a lot of writing comes from silence, and a lack of speech, and that's where the imagination can fill sort of things in. And I mean, otherwise, what are we doing but, and I think I talk about this in the book, transcribing. Life is so boring. It's like, oh, I reached over to the can of sparkling water and I drank it. I mean, how boring. But it's like, I think transcription of things that we're doing in our lives are just not as interesting unless there's a reason for that kind of flat sort of description. It has to have a purpose, I think. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that's what's exciting about memory is its falseness, and how there is really not a lot of truth in it at all. And then what? Yeah.
Wow. No, that's a great point. I love that. No, sorry, keep going.
Oh, no, I was going to say too, it's like you asked about what doesn't make it, like what we don't remember. I think that's even more interesting than what we actually remember. And that's, I think, where a lot of trauma comes in. And we also may remember it, but we don't want to talk about it. And I always say to people, it's like, if you are feeling brave, that's where you want to go in your writing. You want to go to where you feel uncomfortable or you're scared or you're embarrassed, or you don't want to talk about something. You want to try and go there in your writing and see if you can get there at all. Because I think a lot of us are afraid of those spaces, and some of us who try and write into those spaces, we've tried in many genres, and it's like we might try it as fiction, we might try it as creative nonfiction, we try it as a short story or a poem, and finally, if you don't keep trying, finally it won't finally find its like its form, and it may have multiple, you may cover it in different ways, but I think it takes a certain amount of bravery to write into those spaces.
Do you think, Victoria, that you could have ever written this book if you had never come across these documents? Would there have ever been a way for you to access a lot of what you're writing about in the book if you never came across these? You've got marriage certificates in here. You've got photos. Could you have done it, or did it really need, and was it necessary for the book to exist for you to find these documents first?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I think that the documents were necessary, and they were really the prompts and the things that got me thinking about how much I didn't know. Birthdays were changed. My dad had an American name named Peter, and I'd never really heard that before, but it's clearly on his Social Security card. And I don't know, just all these secrets. And then it's think about how many secrets we have, we each have, and then how many secrets that we have from our children. Like our children actually probably know the least about us, yet they spent the most amount of time with us, but they don't know a thing about me, and that's sort of how I think about my relationship with my parents. It's like, wow, I spent the most time with them than anyone else in the world, but I don't know a thing about them. Not a thing.
So
Nothing. True. Nothing. Yeah, their innermost feelings. It's so bizarre. And then, I found this photo where my mom was like or smiling, and I think I think my dad was putting a ring on her finger, and I've just never, and I actually wrote this, the poem is, I've never seen mother smile like this before. It is the kind of smile that only others can see. And yeah, it just got me thinking. I was like, wow, yeah, my mother, she used to smile a lot. And she was once, she once fell in love, or more than once probably. And she experienced all these things that I've experienced, but I would never know those things, like they're forever lost. And I think that's what happens when people die, is you feel what a huge gravity because of all those things that you wish you would have asked them. But you can't. I mean, you're not going to ask your mother these questions. I mean, I wasn't going to. So it's not like if she were alive, I would suddenly ask her all these questions. But I wish I would have asked her more questions, and just, basically you just wish someone would have lived longer, and you would have had more chance to feel these emotions. But the irony and the horror of it is that you couldn't have felt these things unless she died. And that's the weird thing to think about. It's like, I don't know if she were alive now, if I would be feeling any of these things. So you understand that in some ways they have to pass in order for you to feel these things.
That's so true. Victoria, there's another question in the Q&A. It's have you ever thought of A.R. Ahmann's Tape for the Turn of the Year? Did that factor into your process?
It didn't, but someone else had asked me that same question, and I can't even remember who it was. But no, I didn't. That wasn't part of my process. I mean, the only thing I've read that maybe like Ammons is sort of like he's kind of, I mean, I guess I'm kind of like him in some ways, in that he writes these like sequences and series, and he wrote Garbage, which is another book. So yeah, no, I didn't really think about it, but someone did ask me that same question. And if I remember correctly, like he had written some poems on some kind of like paper, some special paper. I'm going to look it up if you know what it is called. It's like adding machine tape or something. I can't remember. Yes. But yeah, he wrote it on, here it is, adding machine tape, and then transferred foot by foot to manuscript. He chose this method as a serious experiment in making a poem adapt to something outside itself. The tape determined both the length of the poem's lines and when it ends. And I think it's like narrow. Obviously this is like
Obit in some ways, right?
That's right, exactly. But it's like, this is an example of asking someone who's under the age of 20, like what a typewriter is, like they wouldn't know. But yeah, adding machine tape. Yeah.
That's interesting. So there's something about those narrow columns that seem to signify the feeding of crucial life-altering information. One of the things that I thought was super interesting, and I just want to remind people one more time, we'll probably be wrapping up soon. If you have any other questions, please drop them in the chat. I did want to ask you, Victoria, about the last letter in this book, which is entitled Dear Reader. You touch on your process, and I loved that you did this. And in fact, after I finished the book, I was like, wow, what if every book we ever read had a letter to the reader at the end that really explained the process and the challenges of writing? And one of the things that you touch on are the ethical issues of writing this sort of book. Specifically, you are writing very intimately about other people, your family members, some of whom are, teachers, friends, some of whom are still alive. Can you talk about your process and how you made the types of decisions about what to include about other people?
Yeah, no, I had to really think about that. And I think all writers deal with this, but especially creative nonfiction writers and memoirists are dealing with this. And, I think there's a point where you become panicked, especially if people are alive. I had the luxury that my mother's dead, and my father, he's alive and physical, but dead. He died to me like 14 years ago. And so when he had a stroke, and so when I see him, it's blank, but therefore he can't protest anything that I write about. My sister is still around, obviously. And so I just actually don't tell her anything that I write. And I think, and I get nervous when I see her friends on my Instagram or things like that, because I'm like, oh, I hope they don't tell her that I have a book out or something like that, because, it is that fraught for me. And there are those, but I had to have that talk with her once. And I said to her, your memory and your experiences are yours and mine are mine. And therefore you own your feelings and your thoughts, but my feelings and my thoughts I also own and are different than yours. And as a writer, you can't really tell me what to write or what not to write or how to write it, because that's unfair to me. And it's also would be, killing the spirit of a writer. And so I don't know how she felt about it, but she didn't say anything. So now we just don't talk about it, which I think is super unhealthy. But I feel like if we talked about it, we'd run into all sorts of problems, because she wouldn't want me to write about anything. And I think that's just not going to happen. So I think we have to make those choices as writers, and there are ethical challenges. And especially when you're writing a letter, you write to someone and they, like I say this, they can't speak back. And I'm writing about silence, ironically, but I'm using the epistolary form, which is silencing those I'm writing to. So I understand that and I get it. So I definitely had to scrub out certain things. I changed certain identifying factors, or, characteristics of people. Sometimes the teachers became morphed into one teacher when there are multiple teachers, things like that. So I definitely had to think about that while still trying to maintain my own truth. But it's definitely, it's an ethical challenge, and people have lost relationships. So many writers talk about this, have lost relationships because of some of the decisions that they felt like they had to make. Other people have gotten sued. I mean, crazy things have happened. I mean, we have the bad art friend, right?
Right.
So there's a lot of stuff related to
what's
ethics.
Interesting to me, though, in hearing about your sister's reaction is that, like, everything I've read of yours, and I've not read all of your books, but I've read 3 of them. To me, it's everything is honoring your family. Like, so It's like, as an outsider, not a family member, right? I feel like what you're writing is so respectful. But on the other hand, I've had family members read things that I thought was honoring them and take it completely, like, it just shocked me at how offended they were when I thought I was portraying them in this incredible light, and I was really showing how proud I was of them. They felt very disparaged. So I can,
I think also, like, we're writers, like, we understand, like, very closely and intimately what we do. And I think non-writers, the pedestrians of the world, I cannot relate to them at all. But they are not used to this. They're not used to excavating feelings or harvesting emotions, and they just don't, many of them don't want to, and also it's about a sense of control. The writer has control. The subjects never do by nature. And I think that makes a lot of people very uncomfortable because they can't control the narrative,
We've got another question in the Q&A section, Victoria. This is from Vanessa. She says, as a Chinese American girl, Dear Memories spoke to me in so many senses, down to a cultural level. And I felt like I could really connect to so many of the underlying narratives through my own grandparents who never left China and my parents who immigrated. In the writing process, did you expect to communicate these images and connect with people who had such shared experiences?
Yeah. Oh, and I also gave a reading at Bishop's. Oh, yeah. I loved Bishop's in La Jolla. It was so wonderful. Nice to see you again. And yeah, I think I don't know if I remember you correctly, but I do. I may remember you, but I don't want to. I remember the whole experience. It was awesome. But yeah, I think I definitely think that the great thing about writing my experiences is that I know that there aren't, or there haven't been, a lot of voices like myself. And if they have been, they've been really spare. So, Amy Tan writes a book, and suddenly the whole world thinks that everyone who looks like Amy Tan has Amy Tan's one experience. There's this kind of anointing that happens and tokenism that happens in this country. And so I really love the idea of having a multiplicity of Asian American voices, writing all different experiences. Julia Wang has a book right now, and she grew up in an undocumented family, very different than how I grew up. My parents were very educated. I love, when other people are writing stories, and they have very different backgrounds too. And so it's not a monolithic sort of thing. But I also recognize there are a lot of people just like me, and they grew up just like me. And so that, in that way, I feel it's such a connection when I read anything. Like Kathy Park Hong is Korean American. And when I read her book, I felt like we had nothing in common, but I still felt such a connection. Like we grew up so differently, and our family backgrounds are so different, but there's so many things in there that I just felt a connection to. Your work, Jaswinder Bolina's work, Sejal Shah, I've read them all because there's been a lot of great literature out recently by Asian Americans from all backgrounds. And so it really makes me happy, but I try and grab all of it and read all of it because no matter what, I feel a sense of pride and connection. So whether I feel like we have similar backgrounds or not. And I do think that diversity can maybe open up the white gaze isn't so singular in its viewing of us as a group of people.
I love that. And I love too that, like, we are having a lot of these conversations in the Asian American community. What is Asian American writing? What does it mean? Who does it include? Who does it exclude? Because for a while, I feel like there weren't enough of us to ask these questions, that there were just a precious few that were sort of let through the gatekeeping. And as you said,
we've talked about that.
Yes. And as you said, because there were so few, right? It was almost like we couldn't criticize our own because we were still just trying to get a leg out the door. But now there are more of us having this kind of dialogue of, how do we relate to one another's experiences? How do we discuss issues about class within our community, about, treating us as a monolithic group, whether it's publishing or any other institutions, right? We're having conversations about disaggregating data among the various ethnicities. So you're right. I mean, that is sort of part of what's happening in the evolution of all the authors you've mentioned in their writing, is that we are able to now relate in ways that might not mean we share a background, but in just the sort of understanding our own identities and our own communities, and whether or not we are born elsewhere or whether we are born here. So I'm so glad that we're at least in this space where we can talk about the evolution of the culture.
That's right. And, there's something that's called nuance, right? And there's difference. And I was reading a lot about J. Caspian Kang and his new book, and how it really, opened up a lot of conversations amongst the Asian American academics. I think that those conversations are necessary and important, and they can be uncomfortable, but I think that they're important to have. We are not all the same. We don't always disagree. We don't always agree. In fact, we hardly ever agree. We can disagree. We see things differently, and that's why I said it originally. It's like I really try hard to honor people working in the field, in different fields, my peers in other areas of Asian American studies, because I feel like they've been working and in organizing, and a lot of the work that you do. It's like people have been working for decades, and I think that if we're going to be writing about, race or migration or class, I think it's important to, it's really important to know what people have been doing long before you, and to understand the nuances, and, not sort of feed into the stereotypes that the white establishment has sort of set out for us for decades. Then we're sort of falling into that trap. And so I think it's important to have very nuanced and deep conversations.
And I think too, I hope we're at a point where there are enough of us writing so that we are allowed the ability to grow as people, right? To sort of make mistakes and make errors in judgment, and to have the ability to sort of reflect, but keep writing, but keep being a part of the conversation, which I think is so important. My own views, I grew up reading mainly white literature in a mainly white community. So, my identity was very much wrapped up in whiteness, and I did not actually come into my Asianness until later in life. 20s, 30s, even 40s. And so, so I hope that, what we continue to do as a writing community is sort of support one another through that process, and understand that none of us have the same experiences. When my nonfiction book came out, some of the feedback I got from other mixed race or Indian Americans growing up in the South was like, that wasn't my experience at all. And I'm like, I think that's fantastic. Like, we need to also not essentialize each other, right? We need to also understand that, like white writers, we we're writing ourselves, and we're writing about
right.
ourselves, and we're not speaking for the community every time.
That's right. That's right. But we've been asked to speak for the communities for our entire lives. And for us too, I think being the age that we're at, I think that, I think I would require empathy and patience from those younger than me who just get things or see things differently. So I'm learning all the time. And I think that it's important to continue learning and growing and hearing what other people have to say, and to accept criticism, but to hopefully grow from it, like you were saying, and to become better writers, better thinkers, better community members, and I think that it's hard, everything's asynchronous too, and so everyone's coming to different things at a different time, and people have different trajectories, and so I think that's important to recognize too. But yeah, I mean, if someone calls me out for something, I'll just own it. I should have, I've changed and grown so much. Even since the last time we met. We were just talking about when we last saw each other, and so much of I've changed and grown, and I'm a different person than I was even then, and I think everyone else here is as well. And so I think that's the beauty of learning, is it never stops, if you're open to it.
Right. And that's a part of extending humanity to one another, right? Is, letting people being compassionate enough about them and kind enough to let them have that time and space to become the person that they're going to be. Because I look at stuff I wrote 3 or 4 years ago, and I just cringe. I'm like, wow, so problematic, and what was I thinking, and why am I catering to whiteness in this? So we're all on the journey in different places. That's part of makes us who we are, and we will all eventually get to where we need to go, right?
That's so true.
Yep. Victoria, we do not have any more questions. So I'm going to turn it back over to Lane. I first want to thank you so much for this conversation, Victoria. For people listening in, I put the names of some of the books in the chat that Victoria mentioned. All fabulous books. Please check them out. I actually just had a book club meeting with Jay Kang's book, and we had a great discussion about it. And I want to thank Charis again for being so supportive to all of the writers out there and their wonderful programming. And please don't forget to buy Victoria's book. It is out now. Let me show you again. Here's my lovely book with all the Post-it notes on it. Dear Memory, it's a fabulous read for the moment we're in, for the pandemic, as is Obit, her book that came out before the pandemic. So please do check it out. And I am going to turn this over to Lane, who hopefully will be joining us for some parting words. There she is.
Still here.
Hi, thank you both so much for a wonderful conversation. It was really amazing to be in the room for. Thank you, Anjali. It's always a pleasure to host you, our hometown friend at Charis. And Victoria, we're so honored to be the final stop on your book tour. We want to encourage folks who have not yet gotten Dear Memory to go ahead now and click the teal button at the bottom center of your screen to order it directly from Charis Books and More. If you have already ordered your book, then we appreciate you, and your book is on its way to you right now. So thank you, everyone watching at home, and have a great night.
Thank you. And yeah, please support them. There's a small independent feminist bookstore. So if you haven't bought it and you want to buy it, or you want to buy Anjali's books, just click there and please support them. Thank you so much for coming. Those were great questions. And thank you, Anjali. Thanks, everyone. Good night.